Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Washington Kurdish Institute. My name is Philip Kowalski, and although I tried to grow my beard out to look as convincingly Kurdish as possible, I'm afraid I have to fess up and admit that I am not Kurdish. I am joining you from my bedroom in Columbus, Ohio, and I am a research associate at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington, D.C., where I work on the Turkey section. We're here today to talk about the 100th anniversary of the Treaty of Sèvres. What is the Treaty of Sèvres? Well, let me give you a bit of background. Over the last several years, anyone who's walked through Washington, D.C. and through the embassies will have noticed that a slew of nations have been celebrating their centenary of independence. Georgia, Lithuania, Poland, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Estonia, you name it. But why not Kurdistan? Where is the Kurdish embassy? The Treaty of Sèvres, which was signed 100 years ago on this day, was supposed to make provisions for an independent Kurdistan. It split Anatolia and the Middle East up, mainly by the main signatories, which were the United Kingdom, France, Italy, and other more minor signatories. It was flawed to begin with because it omitted Kurdish majority areas in Iran, Iraq, and Syria, and mainly focused on what is today southeast Turkey. And it also gave much Kurdish majority land, such as Van, to Armenia, which never came to fruition. Instead of any sort of Kurdish independence, the flawed treaty by 1923 essentially became obsolete. International promises for an independent Kurdistan came to nothing. The result is a continuation to what we see today, Kurds being split between 4 states, and minimal to no effort was made by any of these 4 states, that is Turkey, Iran, Syria, and Iraq, to represent their Kurdish subjects. Today, Kurds are the world's largest stateless nation, an issue that has yet to remedy itself and is often overlooked by the international community. And we're here to discuss how this happened and how the region can move forward from here. So I have 2 wonderful speakers joining me today, Bayan Sami Abdulrahman and Gina Lennox. Bayan Sami Abdulrahman is the Kurdistan Regional Government representative to the United States of America. Key to her role are strengthening ties between Kurdistan and the United States, advocating her government's position on a wide array of political, security, humanitarian, economic, and cultural matters, and promoting and coordinating partnership. Prior to her U.S. appointment in 2015, Ms. Abdulrahman was the High Representative to the United Kingdom. She was elected to the Leadership Council of the Kurdistan Democratic Party in 2010. Before her career in public service, Ms. Abdulrahman worked as a journalist for 17 years. She began her career on local newspapers in London and won the Observer newspaper's Farzad Bazov Memorial Prize in 1993. Which led her to work at the Observer and later at the Financial Times. She worked for the Financial Times of Britain and Japan, where she was Tokyo correspondent. Her late father, Sami Abdulrahman, was a veteran of the Kurdish freedom movement, joining the Kurdistan Democratic Party in 1963 and playing a critical leadership role in the Kurdish and Iraqi opposition to Saddam Hussein's regime. He held the post of Deputy Prime Minister of the Kurdistan Regional Government and General Secretary of the KDP, Kurdistan Democratic Party. Sami Abdulrahman was killed alongside his elder son Salah, 96 others, in a twin suicide bombing in 2004. Ms. Abdulrahman was born in Baghdad. Her family briefly lived in Iran in the mid-1970s before moving to Britain in 1976. She is a graduate from London University. We also have Gina Lennox joining us today. Dr. Gina Lennox is a research writer, having worked in film, radio, and teaching. With 5 published nonfiction books, one being First Snow and Honey, Voices from Kurdistan. She also has a PhD in land ownership, agriculture, and natural resource management. Gina began working with Kurds in 1994 when she made a series of radio programs for ABC Radio National. Their stories would not leave her mind, so in 1998 she returned to Australia from living in Egypt to collect interviews, essays, and stories of Kurds from all over Kurdistan, as well as Armenia and Georgia, for the book Fire, Snow, and Honey. This book was launched at an international conference called Uniting in Diversity, A Kurdish Perspective, held at NSW Parliament House a month after 9/11. The conference was attended by Bashur ministers and presidents of universities and others from other parts of Kurdistan, as well as Australian Kurds from all over political and geographic persuasions. Gina organized meetings between the overseas visitors and Australian politicians, bureaucrats, and universities, and went to do some work for KRG Australia. Then in 2013, 2014, and 2016, Gina worked in Bashur for a construction company and conducted research into agriculture in the Kurdistan region and water resource management in Kirkuk. In 2015, Gina and Zirzan Fatah started Kurdish Lobby Australia to advocate for peace, democracy, and prosperity for all people in all parts of Kurdistan. Gina has been the chief report writer. These reports can be found on the Kurdish Lobby Australia's website. So that's who's joining us today. If it's okay with Gina and Bayan, I would like to launch some questions for you. So I will address the first question to Bayan. My question is, why did Kurdish nationalism experience a delay in its emergence? And which are the consequences of its unsuccessful attempts to create a Kurdish entity?
Well, good morning from Washington, and good day and good evening to everybody who's watching and participating. Thank you very much to the Washington Kurdish Institute for inviting me and Philip for that introduction. So why was there a delay in the emergence of the Kurdish national movement? I think there was a Kurdish national movement, but there were so many other forces and motivations around 100 years ago. We have to remember that what we experience and see today is not what the Kurds were necessarily experiencing and seeing 100 years ago. The Kurds mostly were in the Ottoman Empire. So there were other motivations. Some were religious, some were motivated by their religion, concerned about the Western powers as Christian powers. Some were motivated by concern about who would lead the Kurdish national movement. So I think it was a different era, and we should always remember that when we try to talk about events 100 years ago, not use our mindset today. The other is really the Kurds weren't organized enough. And again, I'm not blaming anybody, that's the circumstance of that time. They weren't organized enough to be able to consistently lobby. They did lobby, they sent somebody to the Paris conference, they lobbied with the British and had some reasonable success, but you need consistent lobbying and you need to have a voice both on a domestic platform and an international platform. And I think the Kurdish movement just hadn't evolved long enough for that to be achieved. So that would be my take on what was happening about 100 years ago.
Great, thank you. And Gina, I wonder if you have any comments on this as well.
Well, I think they were being on the periphery of the Ottoman Empire. For many centuries, Kurds had their own autonomy. So they were in their little kingdoms and running their own show. In the 19th century, the Ottomans started trying to centralise things, and there were rebellions against that process. So regarding delay, I acknowledge all what Bayan has said. But when it came to negotiating after the Treaty of 1920, Kemal Ataturk, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, he was a very powerful, charismatic figure, and he convinced the Kurdish leaders in the Ottoman area that he would, to support him in a push to establish a modern Turkey, and he would give them self-governance. So he promised them, self-governance, which he did not deliver. The other thing, as Bayan pointed out, Kurds were sceptical of becoming a part of a British protectorate, which was part of the condition of forming a Kurdistan. It would be a British protectorate for a period of time, like Iraq was, and so on. And the other thing that they didn't grab at was the fact that it left out so many areas, as you pointed out in your introduction, you know, Van and Mount Ararat and Kurdistan of Syria and Iran, and then most of Bashur, Kurdistan of Iraq. Mm-hmm. So, but, you know, as soon as they were betrayed, I mean, you had 5 rebellions in the 1920s alone. You had 3 in Turkey and 2 in Iran and Iraq, all people rising up saying, we want an independent Kurdistan.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think that the omission of Rojava, that is Iranian Kurdistan, is really critical. Perhaps it was really never going to succeed without any consideration of Rojava. Very interesting points, both of you. I'd like to move on to a new question now. So we're talking about the past. What about the present? Here we are 100 years later. There is no independent Kurdistan. Only the KRG region of Iraq represents Kurdish people, and in Turkey and Syria, well, Syria is a bit of a mess right now, but Turkey and Iran specifically, Kurdish people are essentially not really recognized, not represented by their respective states. So given this situation, what is the status of Kurdish nationalism after 1 century of struggle? I would like to ask you this question first, Gina.
Well, I think 1 century of armed struggle led to Kurds becoming far more politically organised. So, you know, there was a lot of death and suffering and imprisonment and torture and so on, but it meant that Kurds were able to form secular, multi-ethnic political parties out of their guerrilla movements. And that's no small achievement for the Middle East. It meant that Iraqi Kurds were in a good place to ask for what they wanted after the US got rid of Saddam Hussein. They were far more organised than other Iraqis. So they were able to push for a constitution that was federal, that would legitimise the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and for that region to have its own security force. That was huge, while everyone else was, you know, they had no political experience because they'd been under dictatorship. Similarly, in Turkey, the armed struggle of the 1980s reaffirmed the Kurdish identity after decades of being nullified. You weren't even allowed to say the word Kurd or speak Kurdish or whatever. And this led to political parties being formed in the early 90s, which were, of course, promptly banned. And so Kurds had to enter parliament as independents. But with that precursor and the cultural openings from 2010 led to the incredible election victory in June 2015, where HDP won 13% of the vote and 80 seats in parliament. But of course, and then you've got the Syrian Kurds that, on the back of the successes of Iraqi Kurds and you know, what was happening in Turkey, they were able to take advantage of the Syrian civil war, and the battle for Kobani really cemented their status. You know, they got US-led coalition backing, and from, you know, before and after that, they were establishing their own security force, their own administrations, which ended up spanning 1/3 of Syrian territory by 2018. And the only Kurds that were left out of this incredible political progress was Iranian Kurds. And that's because, you know, back in '79, after the revolution, Qasimlo, the Abdulrahman Qasimlo, demanded the Kurds have autonomy in a federal Iran, and the theocracy just wasn't willing to buy that, and the Kurds rebelled and they got slaughtered in a holy war. And ever since, Kurds that belong to any political, cultural or environmental organisation can be put on death row or, you know, imprisoned for many years, even for teaching the Kurdish language in Iran. So they have missed out, whereas the other Kurds in the other three countries have been able to manage municipal councils or regional administrations. They've had incredible success at the sub-state level, but that got too much for the regimes, and we might get onto that, because that success has since been challenged considerably.
Right, yeah. Once again, I'm glad you mentioned Iranian Kurdistan. According to the Hango Association for Human Rights, sorry if I butchered the name, in 2018 alone, Iranian Kurds accounted for 27% of executions in Iran, despite being only 10% of the population. And Iranian Kurds account for 10% of global executions, which is pretty insane considering that Kurds are only 40 million people. So clearly there's an issue in Iranian Kurdistan, and I suspect it's only going to get worse from here on out as the regime doubles down. Bayan, I have a question for you, sort of building on the question that I asked Gina about the future of Kurdish nationalism, but I want to ask you this sort of in the context of the 2017 independence referendum. What would you say is the status of Kurdish nationalism in Iraq after 1 century of struggle and after the 2017 independence referendum?
Well, I think in answer to this question and your previous question to Gina, what I can say is much has changed, but at the same time, little has changed over the past century. We are still divided across 4 countries. As you said, and even further afield, there are Kurds in other parts of the world as well. So in that, and we don't have an independent state. So in that sense, little has changed. But as Gina already mentioned, in Iraqi Kurdistan, perhaps we have the most in terms of international recognition, because the Iraqi constitution recognizes the Kurdistan regional government, the Kurdistan region, and so on. And that status doesn't exist in the other part of Kurdistan. Also, we are able to lobby. I think huge opportunities exist for the Kurds today, wherever we're from, Bashur, Rojhelat, Rojava, or Bakur. One is the Kurdish diaspora. I'm so excited by what I see among the Kurdish diaspora, and I count myself among the diaspora because I went to the UK when I was 11 years old, so I really grew up in Europe. I think the diaspora today has the internet, has satellite television, has mobile phones. The diaspora today can connect across boundaries. It doesn't matter whether you're in the United States, Canada, Europe, Australia. You can connect with like-minded Kurds. And even the young generation, the new generation who've been born abroad, but have a sense of patriotism. I think the internet and social media has opened new tools to the diaspora, and that's very, very exciting. And that is something that nobody can shut down. If you live in Sydney or Washington, DC, or London or Berlin, the reach of some of those authoritarian regimes usually, not always, usually can't find you. So I think the diaspora is a very, very exciting development and will grow and grow in influence overseas, and that does have an impact on Kurdish nationalism back home and the way it progresses. I think the other thing that I can say about Iraqi Kurdistan, and perhaps it applies to other areas of Kurdistan as well, is lobbying. Today, the KRG has 14 offices abroad. We are the diplomatic missions of the Kurdistan regional government. We can talk to the host government. In my case, I can talk to the United States, State Department, Department of Defense, and so on. And this enables us to tell our story ourselves. We are reaching out to these government institutions to tell the story of Iraq from our perspective. to share our view on regional developments, whether good or bad, and hear the Kurdish perspective. And then I would say also the Kurds in Iraq matter in Iraqi elections. We matter both in the number of seats that we get in the Iraqi parliament, but also in the formation of the governments, the selection of a prime minister, the formation of a coalition to create a government. We can also see that in Turkey. The HDP, as Gina mentioned, in 2015 did extremely well. The Kurdish vote had an impact on the election of the mayor of Istanbul. So I think the Kurds in the elections also can have an impact. And then one final point, which applies to Iraqi Kurdistan and Kurds elsewhere, including Syria. The Middle East is a very volatile part of the world. As I said at the beginning, some things have changed, other things have never changed. One of the things that has never changed is the Middle East is very, very volatile. For us, this can be very damaging because it means that we never have a stable enough environment to progress and advance. But there's the other flip side of that is that opportunities come our way. In 1990, Saddam decided to invade Kuwait. A year later, the Kurds rose up, fled to the mountains because we thought Saddam would use chemical weapons again. But actually, the international community came to our aid. And from 1992, we had some relative self-administration and so on. And then 2003, the international community decided to, or the United States decided to remove Saddam. These opportunities come our way and we have to seize them. And the same could be said right now of Syria. The Syrian conflict it's tragic, of course, the number of Syrians who've been slaughtered and displaced, but it has provided an opportunity for the Kurds. So I think these are the dynamics that we live in today that impact Kurdish nationalism in Iraqi Kurdistan and elsewhere. I've spoken a great deal. I haven't addressed your question about the referendum. I can come back to that if you like later on.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that wonderful answer. I would like to move on from here to another question, sort of looking at recent events. At the beginning of the month, it was revealed that the Syrian Democratic Forces controlled region of Syria had essentially signed a contract with a small firm in Washington to extract oil from the oil reserves in Rojava. And it appears, according to the reporting of Amber and Zaman of Al Monitor, that the Syrian Kurdish leadership is hoping to use this oil to sort of conduct diplomacy with the Erdogan regime of Turkey. So I'm wondering, and this is very much like how the KRG established relationships with Turkey in the 2000s. I'm wondering, and this question is for both of you, whoever wishes to answer it, do you think that this sort of KRG oil model is what Kurds should aim for to recognize, to get international recognition? And if so, why? So whoever
Would you like to take that, Leanne? I
Please
think,
go ahead.
well, it has worked up to a point for Kurdistan region of Iraq. The Kurdistan region of Iraq relies on that export of oil to Turkey for its sustenance. When Baghdad can stop all revenue distribution to Kurdistan between 2014 and 2018, and now it becomes even more critical, that oil to Turkey. But it also puts Kurdistan regional government in a very hard place because it relies so much on that oil to Turkey. When Turkey starts bombing Kurdistan of Iraq and establishing military bases and causing Iraqi civilians to deaths, causing livestock and farms to burn, causing villages to be evacuated, the Kurdistan regional government has had to be very diplomatic in its position And I believe it's asked the US for some help in this matter of Turkey airstrikes and drones and helicopters and military bases. And that's the problem, this being reliant so much on one country when that country does not have a good relationship with its own Kurds, let alone other Kurds. I mean, Erdogan was calling Masoud Barzani and Jalal Talabani terrorists right up until 2009, 2010, when they came to an oil agreement. And Turkey also had just as hard a line as Iraq and Iran after the referendum on independence. So putting all one's eggs in one basket is dangerous at any time. Regarding Syria, unfortunately, I think Erdogan is going down a path of no return with Kurds, and it's extremely dangerous for Kurds. Certainly try the oil angle, that, you know, because Turkey obviously wants money. Turkey's economy is in a meltdown, and the lira is, you know, worth less and less, and foreign investment in Turkey is not happening. But I think more to the point, I think this attempt at of the PYD, you know, the Syrian Kurdish parties that make up the Syrian Democratic Council, as well as the Syrian Democratic Forces, trying to come to some sort of understanding with the KNC, you know, Barzani-linked Roj Peshmerga and the politicians of the KNC. I think that's hugely important, a really critical thing for there to be an understanding, but not to repeat the same problems that are in Iraqi Kurdistan, where there's a divided Peshmerga. I mean, you know, it would be good to learn from Iraqi Kurdistan to build something on a more solid base in Syrian Kurdistan, where it's a united security force and so on, somehow. But it would be wonderful for all the parties to accept political pluralism and to form a mixed political platform in Rojava, but respecting what people have sacrificed to get where they are today. And I mean, the rationale with the Roebuck and you know, the other Americans trying to forge this agreement, this reconciliation, is that Turkey will accept the Rojava Autonomous Administration if the KNC is in there. The words coming out of Turkey are not congruent with that understanding. They are now saying KNC is a terrorist. I mean, Erdogan is on a path of calling everyone a terrorist that doesn't agree with him. And so I think we are in a very, very difficult situation now, where Kurds have got to a point where, you know, they've got these administrations in 3 countries, but they're up against regimes that don't want them to succeed. Whether it's Iraq, you know, boycotting Kurdistan with oil, with their revenue allocation, whether it's Turkey fighting military offensives and propaganda wars in Iraq, Syria, and Turkey itself. Bashar al-Assad is promising to go to war with the Kurds in Syria if they don't capitulate to his dictatorship and pre-2011 status quo. Kurds are, as much as they've succeeded so far in 30 years, they're at a very tenuous time now. Mm-hmm. They're going to have to be really careful, really strategic. And I do hope that, you know, at this time, Kurds of different political persuasions can come together. See, I don't believe in uniting, in that I think it's dangerous one organisation represents 40 million or more people. I think the different parties, that's a richness of political culture, you know, that they should embrace, just like they embrace different ethnicities, different religions and so on. I think these different political parties need to coordinate on specific goals and matters of mutual self-interest. But it's so hard when you're up against very ruthless regimes, you know, that...
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, Turkey has never abided by having Kurds. Turkey does have a fear of Kurds.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. I have one more question, and this is for Bayan. After this, we'll move on to audience questions. So, Bayan, Iraqi Kurdistan has a unique opportunity with the possible election of Joe Biden, who is possibly the most outwardly pro-Kurdish politician in the United States. For example, in December 2002, Joe Biden visited Iraqi Kurdistan when he was senator and spoke to the Iraqi Kurdish parliament, pledging U.S. support for what he called the Poland of the Middle East. And Joe Biden has close relations and a friendship with the Barzani family, and has generally spoken up in defense of Kurds, both in Iraq and, as time has gone on, Kurds elsewhere, such as in Syria. So I'm wondering, should Joe Biden become president, what does a home run, perfect Joe Biden policy look like for Iraqi Kurdistan?
Well, that's an interesting question. You're absolutely right that Vice President Biden knows Iraq and Kurdistan very well. He's extremely knowledgeable about the history and the current situation. And as you say, has a good relationship with President Masoud Barzani. And of course, we appreciate that. And should he win, we hope that that background, that history, that understanding will be helpful going forwards. But I want to throw in a note of caution. Many of us have seen, not just in the United States, but in Europe and elsewhere, before coming into power, politicians make statements, make pledges. Not that Vice President Biden has made any pledges specifically in the recent past about Kurdistan, but politicians will often make statements. Once they're in power, they realize the complexity, or they come under pressure or lobbying, and that idea chills and cools down and doesn't have the fire under it that it had before. So I don't want to say anything that would indicate that we have specific expectations from a Biden presidency or a Biden administration. I think we're in a good position with either candidate, frankly. We have very good contacts with the Trump administration, very good access. They have very high regard for the Peshmerga forces. They have supported us, the Peshmerga specifically, since the fight against ISIS, continue to do so. They talk about Kurdistan as partners. So we have good relations with the Trump administration, and I would imagine and hope and expect that we would have good relations with the Biden administration. And I expect that many people who are in the Obama administration would perhaps have positions in a Biden administration, which again means that we're familiar with each other. So I'm optimistic, but also I don't have a blind faith, frankly speaking, about any administration. And I would also say, generally speaking, looking at Kurdish history, Kurdish relations with the United States over a longer period, we have had good and bad experiences with Republicans and Democrats. So we can't say, in my opinion, that the Democrats are great and the Republicans are bad, or vice versa. We have had good and bad issues with both, and they would probably say the same about us. So I think we just have to be very smart and work closely with whoever is in the White House in the United States, and appreciate the fact that Kurdistan region in Iraq, and I would say the Kurds generally, have very strong bipartisan support in the US Congress.
Okay, thank you for that answer. I suppose it remains to be seen. Okay, I would like to move on to the audience questions and answers now. First, I would like to ask a question for you, Bayan, from Dr. Feridan Karim. The question is there any real political move from the KRG to bring the issue of independent Kurdistan to the international level?
Not right now. I mean, we had the referendum in 2017, and we saw the international reaction. The United States, many European countries were even trying to stop us even having a referendum, let alone declaring independence. And the referendum was not going to lead to a unilateral declaration of independence. So even with the step that we took in 2017, there wasn't international support. And I think we have to be realistic about that. We disagreed with that opinion. We said the referendum was legitimate and that we had the right to hold it. And I strongly believe that today. It's unfortunate what happened immediately after the referendum. And I go back to what I think you and Gina were saying earlier. We should have Kurdish unity. It doesn't mean a one-party system, but a multi-party system, but unity in purpose and unity in our defense of what we have achieved and protection of what we have achieved. So I think what we're focused on today is to make Iraq a success, to make Iraq a viable, independent country. It's arguable whether Iraq is really an independent country itself. So what we want is for Iraq to be viable, independent, democratic and federal. And within that, Kurdistan would have all of its rights because of the constitution. And then also to maintain international support, maintain international support and engagement with the Kurdistan region in Iraq.
Great, thank you very much. I'd like to move on to the next question. This can be for whoever would like to answer it. In recent months, Iran and Turkey have both conducted bombing campaigns in Iraqi Kurdistan. So I have a question from Laura J. She's wondering, why hasn't there been any action taken when Turkey bombs Kurdistan in Iraq? And I'd also like to ask, also when Iran bombs Iraqi Kurdistan, where's the international action?
That's the problem. There hasn't been. The Iraq government and the Kurdistan regional government have requested Turkey to stop its airstrikes and to stop its artillery attacks. And Bayan would know more than me about this, but I believe the Iraqi government has written to the UN Security Council asking for it to do something about the attacks. I believe, and I only go on English media, I'm sorry I can't speak Kurdish, I believe that there's been no response from the UN Security Council. I think you've got to, it's terrible. It's like the international silence over Iran and Iraq attacking Kirkuk, you know, a whole lot of things the international community has been paralyzed and silent about. The only exception to that, of course, is when Donald Trump announced withdrawal of US troops from northeast Syria, both in December 2018 and October 2019. And then there was an international outcry about that, which was unprecedented. But no action. And this is the problem. Bayan, how do you explain this total lack of action?
Well, yes, as you said, the KRG and the government of Iraq have lodged a complaint. I believe the Iraqi Foreign Ministry summoned the Turkish ambassador at least twice. We are in a very difficult situation. And with Iran, it's the same. We have complained to Iran. But I think what you touch on, Gina, about the lack of, and the questioner about the lack of international action is really a reflection on the global situation today. And I would recommend everybody to read a book. I was just looking it up to make sure I get the name right. G0 World by Ian Bremmer. So we know about the G7, the G20, and so on. And Ian Bremmer in this book, G0 World, argues that there is a lack of global leadership, that neither the United States, Europe, nor other countries really are taking their position of leadership the way they used to. And there are many reasons for that, quite often domestic reasons, but the result is that we are in this G0 world. And I think we see that not just in relation to Kurdistan, but around the world. I mean, even look at the pandemic right now. We don't really see a global leadership in dealing with a pandemic. We don't see global leadership dealing with climate change, let alone dealing with a NATO member, a member of the G20, attacking a region that is not even a sovereign state. So I think it's partly to do with the G0 world that we live in.
I will take note of this book. So, okay, moving on, I'm going to answer a live question from Peter Gauber. I'm going to put you on the mic now, Peter. Are you there?
Yeah, yes, I am.
Great.
Well, I had wanted to ask Bayan, the ambassador from Kurdistan, as I refer to her, about the question on the referendum, but you've gone ahead and done that. So if I might just offer a couple of very quick observations, and then I'll follow up with one further question. You've been very diplomatic about the US elections, as you should be, but I will observe that Joe Biden has known the Kurds since 30 years ago, this month, possibly today, including when the Taliban and your father came just after the invasion of Kuwait. And so that's really a long track record. I also didn't want to let pass the comment about oil, which was really not about, the Kurdistan oil was not about improving relations with Turkey. It was about having the resources so that it wouldn't be dependent on Baghdad, that real autonomy doesn't work if you depend on a check from the center, but rather if you send a check, you're in a stronger position. And so I think that's what lay behind it. The situation in Syria is quite different. My question is, there's always been, there continues to be discussion about changing the Iraqi constitution, including a rather dangerous procedure that should have expired, and I believe did expire in 2006, but seems to be still on the table, which would allow it to be changed, the powers of Kurdistan to be changed without the consent of Kurdistan. And I wondered where that is. Is that something that's just not happening, or is there a committee that is still exploring constitutional changes?
Thank you very much, Peter.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Galbraith, Peter. As always, very insightful and pithy comments. I'm not aware of this constitutional, or this committee working on changing the constitution. And if they did try to change the constitution to dilute the KRG's authorities, there would be an outcry. And I believe the outcry would not be just from the people of Kurdistan, but would be internationally as well. I think it's the Kurds in Iraq, even though, as I already mentioned, it was made very clear to us that nobody wanted Kurdistan to break away from Iraq, even though the referendum was not necessarily leading to that step immediately. The world made it clear that they wanted us to stay in Iraq. Now, why was that? I think one of the reasons, there are many, but one of the reasons is that the international community sees the KRG, the people of Kurdistan, the culture of Kurdistan, as a democratizing force within Iraq. If you look at Kurdistan's economy, we have many problems. We have a struggling economy right now, a ton of hardship for our people. And yet Kurdistan's economy, by and large, is better than the rest of Iraq. People who visit Kurdistan from southern Iraq are shocked by the roads, the bridges, the hotels, the schools and hospitals. So yes, we have problems, and I'm not underestimating that, but still, by comparison to the rest of Iraq, Kurdistan's in a much better position, much more stable. Foreign companies, including American companies, come to Kurdistan first, or they establish their Iraq headquarters in the Kurdistan region. So I think any serious attempt to dilute Kurdistan region's power and autonomy and position would face huge pushback, not just from Kurds in Iraq. I believe 40 million Kurds would rise up and fight against it. And I think the international community, who pushed back on us for the referendum, would then support us in this instance.
Thank you very much. Gina, do you have anything to add to that?
I agree with Bayan completely.
Okay. I would like to move on to the next question. This one is also for you, Bayan. It's from Bahram Petrosian, Dr. Bahram Petrosian of Yerevan State University. He's wondering if you could evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of the Kurdish diaspora. What do you think is its greatest strength, and what do you think is its worst weakness?
Thank you very much, Dr. Bahram. Nice to hear from you. I mentioned earlier that I'm very excited about the diaspora. The Kurds have been mainly fleeing overseas. I think very few Kurds have gone overseas as students or tourists and ended up staying abroad. Mostly we have fled genocide or repression or some catastrophe. And we've been doing that for decades, perhaps from the 60s onwards. A significant number of Kurds came to North America and Europe in the mid-1970s, including myself, as I was a child at that time. So there is that generation, the older generation, who, like most immigrants, just tried to just manage and survive. Those who were professionals, who were already doctors or scientists in Iraq or Iran or Turkey, took similar jobs overseas. Others had to struggle and just open up small businesses. Today, those people have great experience, whether it's a small business, a restaurant, or a car repair shop, or whether they're doctors and scientists and engineers, journalists abroad. Those people have a lot of experience. And then you have the young generation, the generation of Kurds who were born in the United States, Europe, Australia. And of course, there's a huge Kurdish diaspora around the Middle East as well, in Lebanon, in Israel, in Iran. Not just the Iranian Kurds, there are Iraqi Kurds and others as well. I think all of those, the young generation, are now really using social media and the internet to connect, to lobby. I saw in the chat that somebody is saying some of the regional governments pursue the Kurds who use social media abroad. Yes, that's true, and I acknowledge that. And there is a risk to having an internet profile, because either you can be chased or your family back home can be impacted. But still, we have this tool today, the internet, social media, the young generation of the diaspora. And I think this is a great strength, and we should really think about how to develop this further. What's exciting is that I see young Kurds forming associations and societies that aren't about political parties. I follow this leader or that leader. It's more about Kurdish professionals, which started in Nashville in Tennessee and now reaches young Kurds around the world. The Kurdish Medical Association in the UK, a small group but very powerful voice. So I think these are just some examples of how the diaspora can go forward. The weaknesses, I would say that there is still some disunity. Unfortunately, we see some of the domestic political rivalries spill over into the diaspora as well, which to me doesn't make sense. We don't have enough votes abroad among the Kurds to impact any election back home. Really, we should leave the election fighting and electioneering back home. Overseas, we should be much more united.
Great. Thank you very much.
I'd like to add a couple of things about the diaspora. Already Kurds I know there's one very articulate Kurdish woman in the European Union Parliament, and Kurds are entering parliaments around the world, and I think that should be encouraged. I think, the more Kurds that sort of get employed at the UN or the International Criminal Court or EU, World Bank, Amnesty International, the better. And the other aspect of the diaspora is that, getting highly trained in all the different, law areas, and judges, scientists, renewable energy experts, water resource managers, and all the different training people can get, and exposure to other ways of operating, democratic processes and that. I think this all helps Kurds both in the different countries, but also back home. I know quite a few Kurds have upskilled in the different countries, earned their engineering degrees or whatever, and then they go back to Kurdistan and want to, do their bit for Kurdistan. So as Bayan said, it's a two-way street between Kurdistan and the other countries, and I think it can only benefit Kurdistan if they use the opportunities.
Great. Thank you very much. We have time for two more questions. I'm going to answer a question from Gary Kent of the UK Parliament, or ask a question. This question is, and this is for either one of you, how serious is the danger of Turkey and Iraq establishing a new border crossing that bypasses the KRG?
Okay, well, I'll have a stab at that. Yeah, this is something that has come up every now and then. Prime Minister Abadi in 2017-18, after the referendum, tried to impose what he described as federal authority. We would dispute that, of course. And there was talk about establishing a border crossing, a kind of a trade route that would bypass the KRG. This would be between Iraq and Turkey. So the idea has been there, the danger of it is there. So far, it hasn't happened. And I guess we just have to wait and see. In a way, there's no reason why two countries shouldn't have several border crossings, frankly. I think the problem is that in the Middle East, quite often those countries use trade and economy as a weapon, sometimes against their own people, as we in Iraqi Kurdistan, if not all of Kurdistan, have suffered many times.
The other aspect of this new border crossing is that I think it goes through Nuzbayn, in Turkey, and it still has to come into Kurdistan region of Iraq, I think. It doesn't escape Kurdistan altogether. So it's yeah.
Great.
Still needs permission from the Kurdistan regional government, I believe.
Okay, great. Well, I'd like to move on to the final question. And it's kind of a familiar theme. It wouldn't be a Washington Kurdish Institute meeting if we didn't discuss disunity amongst Kurds. So the question is from Hedi Hamad Ahmed. And he's wondering if you think that Kurds put all the blame on neighboring countries and superpowers and less on themselves, despite the fact that there is disunity among Kurds, a lack of strong leadership, lobbying, economic foundations, and international solidarity.
Well, I disagree with the lack of strong leadership. I mean, I think Kurds have been blessed with some extraordinary leaders, especially the new crop coming up, like Selahattin Demirtas, Muslim Abdi Kabani, Salah Muslim, Mrs. Ahmed, Ilham Ahmed. These are all incredible people that have, go beyond their party, their Kurdishness and their country's politics. So I disagree that there's no, I think, yes, there is a problem with coordinating. I don't like the word unity, but coordinating between parties. But what do you expect when you've got 4 regimes trying to divide and rule? It's not, you haven't got just one regime trying to block you. You've got 4 working, the different Kurds to go against each other. But I do think that, inshallah, Kurds will increasingly value the importance of coordinating with each other, even if they disagree on so many things. Like, particularly PKK and KDP have to come together somehow and come to some sort of understanding and arrangement with each other.
Great. Bayan, any thoughts on the question?
Yes, I have said this many times. Yes, and I agree with Gina. We are, divided between 4 countries. We're surrounded by hostile governments, sometimes hostile, sometimes not so hostile, but it's a tough neighborhood. We are landlocked. We are not a sovereign state, so we don't have any of the some of the accoutrements of a sovereign state. We can't have a voice at the UN and so on. So there are many limitations on us because we don't have a sovereign state. And so, yes, there are all these factors that, let's say, fuel disunity among the Kurds. But I have said this repeatedly and publicly, we are sometimes our own worst enemy. And we should acknowledge that. I acknowledge it, and I hope that I can work towards changing that. I think Kurdish unity or coordination, and I agree with Gina, we can't all always agree 100%, but we can be unified in our protection of what the Kurds have achieved, whether it's in Syria or in Iraq or in Turkey through the HDP and the parliamentary process. We should at least be unified in protecting what we achieve and then trying to build on it. And I think, criticizing politicians and leaders and governments is absolutely right, and everybody should do it, and governments and politicians should take that on the chin. But I think some of the criticism is very corrosive. It's not constructive criticism. It's not the criticism of a fellow Kurd who wants Kurdistan to be successful. Sometimes that criticism is corrosive and it's designed to undermine unity, to undermine faith in the Kurdish project. And I would agree with Gina. I think we have a lot of very good, powerful, successful, highly regarded leaders among all of the Kurds. And I would include the Kurdish leaders that we have in Iraqi Kurdistan. How did they manage to get Kurdistan to where it is today, where it is a recognized entity within the Iraqi framework, when only 30 years ago we were being bombed with chemical weapons and the world was turning a blind eye? So I think disunity is our Achilles heel, but we can cure it. We can do something about it.
Excellent closing remarks here. Gina, I'll let you close.
I think it's important to acknowledge that every Kurdish leader has contributed to where Kurds are today. And that's what I'd like to say. That's an important acknowledgement that I think Kurds need to make, that for all their fallibilities, all their faults, all the problems of corruption and this and that, all Kurdish leaders have contributed to where Kurds are today, and that's miles from where they were 30 years ago.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Gina and Representative Bayan. This was a wonderful discussion. I really appreciate you coming to join us at the Washington Kurdish Institute today. Thank you to our attendees and those who asked questions. And we hope to see you again soon. Take care.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Washington Kurdish Institute.